Hello, my name is Zach Gibbs, and I'm a content developer within education services inside Juniper Networks. And today we will be going through the data center filter-based forwarding router leaf part 1 learning byte. All right, so what do we want to do here? Well, host 1 and host 2 are two hosts in a data center, and they need to communicate. And we want to inspect that traffic, and we're going to send that traffic instead of directly going from host 1 to host 2. We want to redirect or filter-based forward that traffic to the data center firewall, which in our case is the DC-FW. All right, so let's have a look at the topology here. This is a lot to digest, so I'll try to make it as simple as possible. Here in the topology, we have two spines, S1 and S2, and then we have two router leafs, that's router L1 and router L2, and then one service leaf in the middle. And these devices are using edge-routed bridging, and so the underlay and the overlay functionality is already there. And so we're set there. We're not going to worry about configuring the ERB part of things. And so with that, we want to, as I talked about earlier, want to send traffic from host 1 to host 2, but redirect it, filter-based forward it through the firewall, which is DCFW. And you can see that DCFW is connected to service leaf 1. And on this topology, you can see that there's a few different VRFs. You have VRF1, which host 1 and host 2 are a part of. And notice how host 1 and host 2 are in different subnets. They can be part of the same VRF and be in different subnets. That works fine. So they're different VLANs since they're different subnets, which means different broadcast domains. And then we have VRF1, which they connect into, and which is on the router leafs, router L1 and router L2. Then we have the inspect VRFs. Now, the inspect VRFs are for the traffic that needs to be inspected. And then we have the secure VRFs, and that's the traffic that's already been inspected. And there on the firewall, you'll see the inspect zone and secure zone. So as traffic comes into the firewall, it'll be coming into the inspect zone. When it leaves the firewall, it'll leave on the secure zone. And so, okay, so with that, let's just do a quick walkthrough of how this communication is supposed to happen. We have host 1 that initiates traffic to host 2. And so host 1 sends the traffic to router L1 at the VRF1 in router L1. And we have ERB set up, so that means there's a layer 3 gateway there that is sending the traffic to because it's traffic outside of its local subnet, right? And so what happens there is it gets sent to VRF1. There's a firewall filter on the IRB interface that's acting as the layer 3 interface with VRF1. And then that firewall filter-based forwards that traffic to the inspect VRF. And now the inspect VRF is configured with a VNI and a route target that connects it with the inspect VRF on the service leaf. So it goes into that inspect VRF and then gets forwarded to the service leaf inspect VRF. And then from there, the inspect VRF with service leaf L1 forwards the traffic to the firewall. And then it lands on the inspect zone. The firewall does its inspections. It's analyzing whatever it's doing with the traffic, blocking, accepting, permitting, logging. And then once it's done doing that, if the traffic is permitted, then it sends it out the secure zone and the interface that's in the secure zone back towards service leaf 1 and into the secure VRF, which then has a route target, VNI, and things like that matches up with the secure VRF on router L2. And you can see that the VNI is 5992 here on service leaf L1 with the secure VRF on router L2. That's the router leaf L2. Also has the same VNI. And they have matching route targets. Not shown on the slide, but there has to be matching route targets there. So that gets forwarded to there. And then from there, there's a route inside that secure VRF. And I'll show this stuff as we go through the learning byte as well. So don't think that there's just way too much to figure out here, just right here. You know, you don't have to learn it all right here. We'll go through it all. And then in VRF1, it gets forwarded to VRF1, that traffic, and then it reaches host 2. And then the return traffic is basically going to follow the reverse path there. So that's how that works. Okay, so what do we want to do? We want to permit SSH traffic going from host 1 to host 2, and then we want to block and log any ICMP traffic that's going from host 1 to host 2. So we'll have to set that up in the firewall. And yeah, we talked about ERB being in use. We need to configure filter-based forwarding on the router leafs, the service leaf, and we'll have to do some configuration on the firewall, mainly the security policies. I'm not going to go through the firewall configuration as far as the zones and whatnot, because that's not really specific to filter-based forwarding, but we'll still take a look at things there. All right, so with that, let's go ahead and configure the router leaf. Now, this learning byte will have a few major sections. We'll configure the router leafs, and then the service leaf, and then we'll look at the firewall, and then we'll do some verification. So we'll see that as we go. So with that, let's go ahead and jump to leaf router L1 and get this going. All right, so here is the CLI of leaf router L1. And one thing I want to point out is that we will be jumping back to the topology because this is a lot to try to do and try to explain without jumping back to the topology. And so keep that in mind as we're doing this. I'm just going to jump back and forth as we go. So with that, let's go ahead and jump back to the topology. And here is our topology. So we are configuring router L1. And that means we'll need to configure inspect VRF. And we won't be configuring VRF1. That's already configured because that's part of the ERB architecture. So let's go ahead and jump back to router L1. And remember, this is a router leaf, hence why it's called router L1. And we want to jump to the inspect VRF. That's going to be a routing instance. This has not been configured yet. And before I show that, let's look at the current VRF1. You can see that's already configured. Notice how the route target is target :123:1. That matches on router L2, that leaf on the other side that host 2 connects to. That matches there. That's very important that that matches. And that's just basic ERB. So keep that in mind. That's not really part of filter-based forwarding. However, it is part of ERB. Okay, so with that, let's go ahead and configure the instance type. We need to set that to VRF. And then we don't necessarily need to, but it's good practice to put a loopback interface in here. And this loopback interface isn't configured yet, so we'll need to configure that later. And then we set the route distinguisher. And let's go ahead and set that to this IP. Well, it's going to be based off of the IP address, the loopback address. But we do need to make it unique. And we're just naming this what you see here with the :5991. And so just with the other device or with the service leaf that is a part of the inspect VRF, we won't, it'll be unique on that side with the route distinguisher itself. All right, so with that, we need to set the route target. So we'll use VRF target, and we'll say target 6501.001.991. And this is going to need to match with the service leaf because these two routing instances, these two VRFs will need to connect together. All right, then we need to create a static route that points towards host 1. And we need to say next table, we need to specify vrf-1.inet.0. And what this does, there's really two parts of it. What it does, it allows the return traffic coming back that is for host 1. So the return traffic is going to be from host 2 to host 1 when host 1 initiates from host 1 to host 2. And so the return traffic, when it hits this VRF, it'll know how to get back to the VRF1 VRF. And then the other part of it is we're going to use an export policy to export this into the EVPN as a type 5 route. And so then host 2 knows how to get back to it as well, and also the firewall and whatnot. So this is very, very important. All right, and so with that, let's set up the leaf here to advertise the IP routes into the EVPN. So we need to say protocols, set protocols, EVPN, IP prefix routes, advertise direct next hop. We want to specify direct next hop. We don't have to do that, but we have to do some other things. This is a nice, quick, easy way to do it. So it uses the direct next hop. And then we have the encapsulation VXLAN. Now we need to set the VNI. This is important. It's going to be 5991. And you might realize this kind of matches the route distinguisher that we set up. That's not absolutely necessary, but it kind of makes it nice to track things down that way. So I like to do that. And then we need to set an export policy. What are we going to export into the EVPN as type 5 routes? So set export, and we need to specify a policy. Now this policy has not been created yet. So we'll need to create this policy as well. And so we need to configure the interface, the loopback interface, as well as that policy. And so let's go ahead and create that loopback interface right now. And again, this isn't strictly necessary. It just kind of makes it nice so you can see where the routes are coming from and make sure stuff's getting passed correctly. And then after that, we need to configure the export policy that we just created there, or applied there, rather. We need to create it. So let's go to policy options, policy statement, T5 underscore inspect underscore export. So this is the export policy for that inspect VRF. That's where that's coming from. And then we need to set one term from protocol direct. We want to accept that. And set a second term that is from protocol static and accept that. And so that's going to grab that loopback interface, or the address associated with the loopback interface, and also that static route. And we're going to advertise that towards the service leaf. And recall, we haven't configured the service leaf yet, so we'll still need to do that. Okay, so now that we've done that, here we can look at the routing instance again. We can see that, okay, we don't have any warnings this time like what we had before. We have everything configured. And now we need to configure the firewall filter. So let's go ahead and jump, because this is going to be what we use to send the traffic into the filter base for the traffic towards the inspect VRF. So let's go ahead and create a filter. We'll just call this inspect traffic. And we need to set some terms here. Term 1. Actually, let's call this host 1 to host 2. And we're going to say from source address. And this is going to be host 1 source address. And then destination address. And host 2's destination address. And then we need to say then we're going to specify the routing instance. And it's going to be our inspect VRF routing instance. And then I like to count the traffic here. It's not necessary, but it is nice to set up a counter, so you know if it's actually hitting that firewall filter term and being sent towards the routing instance. Very helpful for verification troubleshooting. And then if we look at this, we need to add a second term. If we don't, then all other traffic will get blocked because firewalls have an implicit deny. So let's go ahead and say set term, let's say rest traffic, then accept. So we want to accept all other traffic. And so things look good there. And so what we need to do next is we need to jump to the layer 3 interface. Now, if we go to the routing instance VRF1, you can see in here that we have two IRB interfaces, IRB 10 and IRB 20. We need to apply this firewall filter to one of those interfaces. So let's go to the IRB interface and have a look here. All right, so here you can see we have unit 10 and unit 20. And so you might ask yourself, well, what do we want to apply this to? Well, recall that host 1, the IP address is 10.1.1.1/24, which is part of unit 10. Unit 20 is 10.1.2.101/24, and they have a virtual gateway address as well within that same subnet. And so that would be what host 2 is a part of. Now that is done this way because ERB is set up. So the layer 3 gateways are here on the leaf devices. And so it's set up this way for that reason. And so you want to use unit 10. Apply that filter as an input filter. And that is the configuration for leaf 1. Let's go ahead and commit that configuration. Or router L1, which is the leaf connected to the host 1 device. Okay, so now that we have that device configured, router L1, let's configure router L2. But let's jump back to the topology and have another look at the topology to make sure we know what we're doing. So let's go ahead and jump back there. Okay, so here is the topology, and you can see host 2 is connected to router L2. So that's a leaf device in our data center. And recall we are using ERB, so edge routed bridging. And so the layer 3 and layer 2 gateways are on the router leaf devices. And so what we did previously is we configured router L1, that leaf device, we configured the inspect VRF. And so what we need to do now is, and we also configured the filter-based forwarding with the firewall filter. And so what we need to do now is we need to configure the secure VRF on router L2. And what happens there is it's going to be very similar to the inspect VRF. One big difference here is notice how we use VNI 5991. We're using VNI 5992. And that's going to match up with the secure VRF service leaf L1 VNI here. And same thing over here. VNI 5991, VNI 5991 with the inspect VRFs. So that's important. Those need to match. And also the route targets need to match for the inspect VRFs, and as well as a different route target needs to match for the secure VRFs. And so here with router L2, that router leaf, we are going to be configuring the secure VRF. Now, this is ERB. VRF1 is already configured, but we'll still take a look at things there. And again, host 2 is in a different subnet, different VLAN than host 1. Just something I want to point out. And so with what we're going to focus on right now is the configuration of router leaf router L2. So let's go ahead and jump to the CLI of router L2 and get this going. All right, so here is router L2, and let's jump into configuration mode. Let's go to the routing instances hierarchy and have a look here. And you can see we have VRF1. We see the route distinguisher, the interfaces, interface type, VRF. The VRF route target, that is the route target, is target :123:1. And recall that VRF1 on router L2, so that leaf on the other side that is connected to host 1, also uses that exact same route target for the VRF. That's very important. Those two need to match. They're a part of the same VRF. And so with that, let's configure the secure VRF routing instance. Set the instance type as VRF, and then set the interface, loopback interface 992. Now, again, just like with router L2 leaf, it's not necessary, but it is helpful for tracking purposes that we're setting around the loopback interface into the EVPN as a Type 5 route. And so we'll need to set the route distinguisher, and we're going to set that based off of just the loopback address, and then specify after the colon, it's going to be based off of the VNI. And then we need to set the route target. Set that to target 65001:992. Now, if you remember with the leaf router L1, that router leaf, we used a similar route target, but that route target was target 65001:991. And so it doesn't match here because it shouldn't match. We don't want it to match here. It will match with a secure VRF that is on the service leaf. And so with that, see here, we haven't created the loopback interface yet. So let's go ahead and set that. And so that is set. We don't have that warning anymore. And then we need to create a static route. And this is for host 2. We say next table brf-1.inet.0. And if you remember with configuring the leaf router-L1, we did that for host 1 because on that leaf, host 1 needed to be reachable through the inspect VRF. And that was for the return traffic for R2 to be able to get to host 1 from the inspect VRF. And here, it's something very similar, just the reverse. We are setting the static route here, so host 1, the initiating traffic from host 1 can get to host 2 through the secure VRF. And so we will be exporting this static route into the EVPN as a Type 5 route. And so with that, let's go ahead and configure the Type 5 route parameters. And so let's say protocols, EVPN, IP prefix routes, advertise, direct next hop, encapsulation, VXLAN. Set the VNI. This is going to be 5992 for the VNI. And then we need to set the export policy. This is going to be T5_export. Actually, let's do secure_export. And that hasn't been configured yet. So let's go ahead and configure that policy. And so policy options, policy statement, T5 secure export. Term 1, this is going to look very familiar to what we did on router leaf router L1. And so with that, we'll say set from protocol direct, set then accept, and we're going to configure a second term that's from protocol static, then accept. And so if we jump back to the routing instance, we can see here that we have configured that export policy, and it's not giving us a warning now. So that'll export the static route we have configured and the route associated with the loopback unit 992 interface. And so the next step would be to configure the firewall filter. And again, we have the VRF1 routing instance, and we have the two interfaces, IRB10 and IRB20. And so we need to figure out which interface we need to apply it to, the firewall filter that is. And if you look at here, you can see that host 1 is in the subnet of IRB.10, host 2 is in the subnet of IRB.20. So we're going to apply that firewall filter there on unit 20. But before we apply it, we need to create it. So let's go ahead and create that firewall filter. I should have done that first. Call the term host 2 to host 1 since it'll be the return direction. Set the host address. We'll set it to match on the host 2 source address. And then the host 1 destination address. Say routing instance secure. So this is going to be going to the secure VRF because this traffic at this point will already be inspected and analyzed by the firewall. And then we need to set a counter. Again, strictly not necessary, but it's really helpful for troubleshooting purposes and verification. And then again, we want to set a catch-all term for any other traffic. And then let's jump back to the IRB interfaces. Recall, it's unit 20 we want to use here for the input filter. And that is the configuration for the router leaf router L2. All right, so that brings us to the end of this learning bite. We demonstrated how to configure router leafs with regards to data center filter-based forwarding. So as always, thanks for watching.
Visit the Juniper Education Services website to learn more about courses. View our full range of classroom, online, and e-learning courses. Learning paths, industry segment and technology-specific training paths. Juniper Networks Certification Program, the ultimate demonstration of your competence. And the training community, from forums to social media. Join the discussion.